Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion with Professor Steven Greer on Islam and academic freedom. I'm Megan Manson, Head of Campaigns at the National Secular Society, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's really great to see so many people tuning in. And especially warm welcome to those tuning in to a National Secular Society event for the first time. The NSS champions the separation of religion and state and equal respect for everyone's human rights, so no one is disadvantaged nor privileged because of their beliefs. Our campaigning work is supported by our members and supporters entirely, so if you share our vision and you'd like to support us in making a stand for fairness and individual rights, please do consider joining us today. At the NSS, we've defended free speech from religious threats since our founding. We played an instrumental role in abolishing the blasphemy laws in Britain, but serious concerns still remain. Throughout the UK, religious fundamentalists seek to impose their blasphemy taboos on others through violence and intimidation. And one of the individuals who has unfortunately experienced this firsthand is our guest tonight, Professor Steven Greer. Professor Greer is an internationally renowned human rights scholar who was falsely accused of Islamophobia by the University of Bristol's Islamic Society, or BRISOC. Despite being officially exonerated on all allegations, the university cancelled the module of his human rights course, which was targeted by the complaints. It was a module which included discussion of the Charlie Hebdo shootings, very important module. And not only that, Professor Greer was also left in fear for his life from Islamist attacks, as well as feeling betrayed by the very institution he expected to defend him. And now he's a research director at the Oxford Institute for British Islam, and he's published a book, got here. It's a really good book about his experiences in the hope that it'll encourage others to take a stand for free inquiry and debate. I will shortly let Professor Greer tell his own story, and then in the latter half of the event, he'll answer as many questions from everyone as he can. You are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom at any time during this talk. Please do keep them coming in. The talk is scheduled to to end at 7 p.m, but we might overrun a little if there are lots of questions. If you do need to leave at any point, please do. This event is being recorded and the video will be published later. So if you would rather remain anonymous, if you choose your question, please do indicate this when you ask it. I'd just like to say thank you to Buddha Holder, who's in the background here. He's helping to make sure all the technology tonight runs smoothly. So thank you very much, Buddha. And now finally, I'd like to hand you over to Professor Steven Greer himself. Professor Greer, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and congratulations on your new book, which is a real eye-opener. Of course, what everyone wants to know is what happened at Bristol University. Could you please summarise the events?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Megan, for those very generous introductory remarks. It's a very great pleasure and honour to be discussing my book and my experience here this evening. This is especially so since there were times over the past couple of years when I doubted if I'd even live to tell the tale, let alone be able to do so at such an august venue and in the presence of such a distinguished, what I'm sure is a very distinguished audience. My ordeal began on the 15th of February 2021. It was then I discovered that the University of Bristol Islamic Society, BRISOC, frustrated by the lack of progress with the formal complaint, had just launched a potentially life-threatening social media campaign against me based on nothing but lies, distortion and misrepresentation. The formal complaint lodged the previous October was not only manifestly vexatious and ill-founded, it had been submitted months after the specified deadline. The complainant, a medical student, had not been party to any of the events in question. Instead, he relied upon rumour and hearsay from anonymous alleged third parties. He also refused to engage in mediation or conciliation as the regulations require. The university also negotiated with BRISOC for 3.5 months before I was even informed of the charges against me. BRISOC's complaint and campaign alleged multiple counts of Islamophobia in my teaching and other public output. An online petition demanding an apology to all Muslim students was soon signed by thousands and eventually by over 4,000. The campaign also attracted over 7,000 likes on various social media platforms. And if I refused to apologise, BRISOC called upon the University of Bristol to discipline me, including by dismissal. They also insisted that the Islam, China and the Far East module on my Human Rights and Law, Politics and Society HRLPS course should be scrapped. And this was all in spite of the fact that by this stage, I'd taught both without significant alteration, difficulty or complaint, including to many Muslim students for nearly a decade and a half. BRISOC also falsely claimed that my alleged misconduct had been repeatedly drawn to the university's attention for many years, but nothing had been done about it. In fact, their complaint was the first that was made to the university. Just over a week after the crisis broke, my wife and I were so unnerved by a suspicious incident outside our home the day Al Jazeera reported the controversy that I fled Bristol with her to stay somewhere safer a long way away for several days. For several weeks thereafter, I wore a disguise every time I left the house, which wasn't often because it was during lockdown. And I also carried a stout umbrella and a screwdriver for my own protection. In July 2021, a University of Bristol inquiry exonerated me completely and without equivocation from all BRISOC's accusations, an outcome unanimously upheld on appeal that October. But meanwhile, the university prohibited me from telling anyone except my immediate family about my official vindication until it drafted a public statement with both me and BRISOC, which never in fact materialized. In September 2021, the law school removed the Islam, China and the Far East module from the HRLPS syllabus, expressly in order to avoid further complaints of the kind BRISOC had made and to protect Muslim students from being othered. The Bristol Scandal was reported on the 12th of September 2021 by the Mail on Sunday with the headline, "University clears Dawn of being anti-Islam, but cancels his course anyway." In October 2021, the university publicly announced my exoneration, while at the same time stating it recognised BRISOC's concerns. It also claimed that the HRLPS course had been altered in order to respect the sensitivities of students taking it. These three developments, prohibiting me from announcing my exoneration, the cancellation of the module, and the official statement, together constitute a defiant and shocking repudiation by the University of Bristol of the outcome of its own official inquiry. Even more worrisome, of course, is that they also sent a clear message that in spite of the assessor's verdict, I may not have been entirely blameless after all. The University of Bristol should have stopped BRISOC's campaign by disciplining the students involved. Instead, it not only failed to do so, it potentially compounded rather than protected me from the risks the campaign posed to my personal safety. Exhausted and demoralized by the whole experience, I was signed off work by my doctor from September 2021 to the beginning of January 2022. But early in 2022, my fortunes changed dramatically when, in response to the Mail on Sunday report, I was appointed the first visiting research fellow and later research director at the Oxford Institute for British Islam, a newly established independent progressive Muslim think tank and research academy. I think it's important to note here that in view of the fact that this discussion is about Islam and freedom of speech, that one group of Muslims, BRISOC, sought to restrict my freedom of speech, but yet another, the Oxford Institute for British Islam, came to my rescue. By the time my fit note expired on the 3rd of January 2022, I had made a full recovery from the immediate damage to my mental health caused by the Bristol Scandal. But failing to tackle the toxic environment in the law school, my employer also made it impossible for me to return to work on campus from January to September 2022 when I retired. Several futile attempts were even made to stop me from working from home. Although I continued to receive my normal salary, my status for the last 9 months of my professional life was therefore far from clear. But not being a particularly avid gardener, I didn't regard myself as being on gardening leave. Instead, I busied myself with several research projects derived from my association with OIBI, including my book. However, I couldn't physically return to work at the law school because the environment there was both toxic and potentially unsafe. For example, two societies the law school supports, University of Bristol Unity and Diversity in Law, and the University of Women in Law Society, had each signed Bristol's petition to have me sacked without having bothered to check its veracity. Now, my book is not, of course, intended to be an exercise in self-pity, whinging, or in seeking revenge. If it were, it's unlikely anyone would be interested in reading it. Instead, it has the following principal objectives. I want to document my experience, both in order to set the record straight and to provide a firm and clear evidential basis for my reflections upon it. I also want to name and shame the institutions and organizations responsible for the egregious injustices I've suffered, namely Bristol and the University of Bristol, in an attempt to hold them accountable in the court of public opinion. Ideally, I'd also like them each to receive a more official sanction, but that's beyond my control. In the book, I also consider the wider implications of my ordeal in the hope that this might help protect others from suffering a similar fate, or at least offer some encouragement if they do. The book also seeks to demarcate and reflect upon the distinction between responsible critical engagement with Islam from prejudiced hostility towards it. Sadly, although I'm not aware of any comparable false charge of Islamophobia against a British academic, what has happened to me is otherwise far from unique. It is rather just another example of the rising tide of academic cancel culture and the corresponding lack of effective commitment to academic freedom on the part of many institutions of tertiary education throughout the English-speaking world and beyond, including the University of Bristol. At the beginning of March this year, I wrote to Bristol's VC, proposing that a negotiated solution could bring this whole sorry saga to a definitive conclusion. She replied that this could not happen unless I withdrew the threat of litigation, which would of course leave the university free not to implement anything that was agreed. So negotiations have stalled. I was almost broken by Bristol's campaign. They clearly intended to ruin my reputation, prematurely end my career, deprive me of my livelihood, and ostracize me from my colleagues. They were also at best reckless about the risks the campaign posed to my emotional and psychological health, and at best indifferent to the possibility that it might have inspired a third party to carry out a possibly lethal physical attack. Yet far from destroying or silencing me, the campaign has turned out to be a spectacular own goal, because ultimately it has provided fresh and even more credible platforms, including my book, This Occasion, and the opportunities presented by my appointment as research director of the OIBI, from which to disseminate the views Bristol and their associates so wrongly regard as Islamophobic. Many total strangers who have since become treasured friends have also rallied to my cause. So I look forward to answering any questions you may have once Megan and I have further explored some of the issues my case and my book raise.
Oh, Professor Greer, thank you so much for that really good summary of what happened. I think everyone will be quite shocked to hear about how you were treated. But it is good to hear that now things have been getting better for you with your new appointment and your book. Somebody did ask me, sorry, to hold it up a bit yeah, I didn't notice how blurred it was. So that's the title of the book, Falsely Accused of Islamophobia. It's available quite widely online.
My publisher is very keen that that their name gets mentioned. Academic Press. It's an American publisher. So
Academic Press.
Academic Press, yeah.
Thank you. So, reading your book, it was talking about the actual course which the complaints were targeting. So that's the Islam, China, and the Far East lecture within the Human Rights Law and Politics course. Can you tell me a little bit more about this content and why you think it prompted such a vicious campaign from the Bristol Islamic Society?
Yeah, certainly. Since the mid-1980s, I've taught various human rights courses in various places. But until about 15 years ago, those in the University of Bristol Law School were perhaps not surprisingly very law-oriented. Then around 2005, I had the opportunity to design and to teach a unit which sought to integrate my interest in human rights with my backgrounds in law and social science. And what emerged was an optional unit I named Human Rights in Law, Politics and Society. It originally had 9 modules or topics, each involving a 50-minute lecture supported by a 2-hour seminar. The unit could have been described as socio-legal or as a social science unit, but my preference was to call it a critical engagement with global current affairs through a human rights lens, or vice versa. Needless to say, it had to be approved by the law school and the university before it found its way onto the curriculum. And as with every other unit on the law curriculum, the content was described every year in annual course advertising. It was also audited every year since, including by a series of external examiners who unanimously praised it and never found anything to complain about it. Hang on, just bear with me here. Yeah. The law school also conducted a thorough review of the entire undergraduate law curriculum in 2019-20. Human Rights and Law, Politics and Society is one of the few units which remained without discussion or query. Had there been any suspicion of Islamophobia, this would have been the ideal opportunity for the future of the unit to have been considered. And every year without exception, the unit also attracted the more reflective and thoughtful students, including a significant proportion of Muslims. Student performance and assessment was also one of the highest in the law school, with about a third obtaining first-class marks, including several outstanding results. Now, all of this raises the question which you yourself have asked, Megan. Why did the Bristol Scandal erupt when it did? Well, the answer is that it appears to have been motivated by an attempt to discredit me because of my public defence of the Counter-Terrorist Prevent programme, an independent review of which was then just about to begin. Indeed, my stance on this was one of the things that Bristol complained about. But it was also probably intended to offer oblique support to a professor of sociology at the University of Bristol, David Miller, who was then under investigation for anti-Semitism and was eventually sacked for professional misconduct.
I see. Thank you. So I think one of the other reasons you mentioned why you were targeted was your support of the Prevent programme.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think Prevent is necessary and your reaction to the recent William Shawcross review of the programme? Is there anything about the programme that you think needs to be changed to improve its effectiveness?
Yeah, well, I've written about this quite extensively, including in my previous book, Tackling Terrorism in Britain, which was published by Routledge in 2021, towards the end of 2021. And there's a chapter about Prevent on that. Basically, a lot of the hostility towards Prevent is misconceived and is based upon kind of grotesque caricatures about it. If you ask anybody, should terrorism be prevented? Only people who are terrorists and who support terrorism would say no. Everybody else will say, yes, of course, terrorism should be prevented. But then if you say, well, how precisely should it be prevented? The answer to the anti-Prevent people will say, anyway, except through the Prevent programme. But if you ask them to give you a detailed specification of the kind of activities that should be engaged in order to prevent terrorism. They'll not be able to tell you. Prevent is basically an exercise in safeguarding not just the public, but people, the vulnerable people who may themselves be drawn into terrorism because they are seduced by it and haven't thought it through carefully enough. A referral to prevent is nothing to be concerned about. In fact, I would love to be referred to prevent to see how it works. It's not an attack upon anybody. It's not doesn't stigmatize Muslims or anybody else. It's not racist or anything like that. The reason that has been until recently targeted more upon Muslims than upon anybody else is because Islamist terrorism, jihadi terrorism, is the principal terrorist threat the UK faces. Over 90% of the fatalities in terrorism since 9/11 in the UK, including Northern Ireland, have come from Islamists. Only a tiny handful have come from the far right. Yet the far right is now featuring even more prominently. In fact, one of the biggest categories in the prevent referrals is for this category, this mixed category, which is neither far right nor Islamist. So basically, the prevent program, I think, is sound from a democratic and human rights point of view. It's not racist and Islamophobic. All the evidence suggests otherwise. As far as but there are things that are wrong with it. One of the main ones being a lack of transparency, and the kind of referral. People sometimes do get referred to prevent for silly reasons. There's all kinds of stuff in the press about the little boy, for example, who was referred to prevent because he made reference to having lived in a terrorist house rather than a terrorist house. But in that particular case, the reason the police took an interest because in the essay concerned, he'd also mentioned that he was being beaten by his uncle. So there's all kinds of stuff going on and all kinds of urban myths about prevent. Basically, I think it's if you take it away, it is the question: what do you put in its place? And virtually every country in the world has some kind of prevent style program. In fact, the British prevent program is based on the model that was developed. One of the first ones was developed by Saudi Arabia. Although they've got a very poor human rights record, of course, in this particular case, it's their record is exemplary. They try to do what we try to do in this country, which is to say, identify people who are vulnerable to being drawn to terrorism and try and talk them out of it. So yes, I broadly welcome the Shawcross review. I think one might debate some of the finer details of it, but broadly speaking, it's sound, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good explanation, I think. So you were talking, obviously we've been talking a lot about academic freedom in the tertiary sector, but in recent years, very recently, we've seen so-called blasphemy incidents happening at schools. Obviously, there was just a couple of years ago a teacher from Backley Grammar School who is still in hiding after being threatened for showing a picture of Muhammad during an RE lesson.
Yeah.
And then even more recently, we've got the incident at Kettlethorpe High School in Wakefield, where people were suspended and got death threats over a Quran getting slightly scuffed. What's your take on these?
Well, they're appalling, of course. I mean, nobody should be threatened with any repercussions for either of these things, certainly not death. And I think it may be that there's a question about, I think people have the right in this country to show the representations of Muhammad, but given the climate, it's not always wise to do so. So that is the climate has made that a dangerous thing to do. But on the other front, it's even more appalling that an autistic boy who apparently accidentally dropped a copy of the Quran in a school corridor should be vilified in the way in which he was. And It does raise the question, I think, that needs to be asked of those Muslims who would condemn that and who would want to punish for that, because it's quite understandable, I think, for unacceptable for Muslims to regard the message in the Quran as being sacred and as being holy and valuable and so on and so forth. But that's quite a separate question from the physical, like the actual physical object, the book in which it's contained. It strikes me as being dangerously close to idolatry, if not idolatry itself, to regard the physical book as being of such sacred importance that somebody can be punished for accidentally damaging it. So I would like to hear from those Muslims who would want to do that, how they think that can be defended when only God should be worshipped.
There's an interesting theological take there. That's a really good point. It's often assumed that this is the problem, is that all religious people think the same, and therefore they're all going to find this offensive, when in fact there's a huge diversity of opinion, and that's of course one of the problems. So is this the sort of work you're currently doing with your new role?
Well, we're still trying to find my way with it. We're a very small organization, and I only became research director last summer. I was finishing off my book and editing. I've been editing some of the papers from our inaugural conference in August last year at St. John's College, Oxford, which was very successful and very well attended. So that's been the main thing. We're trying to get some kind of institutional connection with the University of Oxford. There are various irons in the fire about that, but nothing has yet come to pass about that.
Oh, it sounds exciting. So obviously all the best of luck. There are loads of questions there in the Q&A. Just before we get onto them, I've got one last question I think I'd like to ask myself, which is, what might be done to better protect academic freedom and wider freedom of speech from the kind of threats posed by Islamists, by fundamentalists, and others, and groups like that?
Well, I'd like to confine myself, if you don't mind, to universities. When I was a student over 40 years ago, this was not an issue at all. Nobody could have believed that British universities would not be a safe place for academic freedom, and that universities would be flaky about academic freedom. And back then, and in principle, universities should be allowed to police themselves in this respect. But sadly, we've discovered, my case is a classic example, perhaps not a common example, but there are enough similar cases to demonstrate that British universities cannot be trusted any longer to respect academic freedom. They need to be regulated more effectively. And I think this could happen in one of three ways. I think the most effective way of getting the British universities to recognise their responsibilities and the consequence in relation to academic freedom, and the consequence of not doing it effectively, is to threaten their income streams. So, I mean, this sounds like a very draconian proposal, and it is. But I think nothing else seems to be working. So I would propose that if any British university is found to be in breach of its legal duty to protect academic freedom, it could be its income stream should be threatened in one of three ways: being fined by the Office for Students, having its funds slashed by the Department for Education, or the withdrawal of donations from alumni and others. And there's a new organisation on the scene now called Alumni for Free Speech, which is tasking itself with mobilising the alumni of different universities in a way to exert pressure upon universities themselves to take freedom of speech more seriously. And that's, I think, potentially a very powerful way forward. There was a chap in Durham a few months ago now, who decided to divert a donation of £400,000 he was going to make to the University of Durham, which was his alma mater, to the Free Speech Union, because he was so appalled by how the University of Durham was failing in its responsibilities to protect freedom of speech. If more of that were to happen, I think the prospects for freedom of speech in British universities would be a lot brighter.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go on to the audience questions. The number one question we're getting, we've had lots of similar questions here, so I think I'll try to. I'm sorry if I'm not going to address your question individually, but I think this question basically sums up what people have been asking, which is just looking at the concept of Islamophobia. So people are asking questions, questioning the very concept of Islamophobia and sort of definitions around Islamophobia. So obviously there's the all-party parliamentary group's definition of Islamophobia. How is this? What's your thoughts on its potential to impact free speech around Islam? Obviously, these things are very well intended, but what's happening here?
Well, I think there is such a thing as anti-Muslim prejudice. I mean, I don't think that can be denied. And whether you call it Islamophobia or not is another question. I mean, phobia, of course, technically means an irrational fear of something, rather than an antagonism towards it. But I mean, if you're afraid of something, you may be antagonistic towards it. So I think we're too far down the line to restrict phobia just to fear. There's transphobia, there's xenophobia, there's homophobia, there's Islamophobia. But the issue with Islamophobia is it's a sort of visceral hostility towards Islam or Muslims, driven by half-truth, caricature, myth, and that kind of thing. And that's the problem that I have faced and that BRISOC doesn't understand, is that that's quite separate from and independent from legitimate critical engagement with Islam. Because the reason, what you see, Islam has got huge implications for governance, the way societies are regulated and constructed, the way in which individuals behave. And that therefore invites anybody to engage with it, because it raises all kinds of questions. And Islam doesn't speak with one voice in these questions. That's another thing that is pretty self-evident. There's a whole range of outlooks on this question. And the reason why I'm involved with the OIBI is because, as a non-Muslim, and they were very happy to have me on board, and they even have atheists on board, may be very surprising, is because they want to try and cultivate a progressive liberal Islam in this country for its own sake, and also because otherwise Muslims are going to be become more marginalized, more alienated, and that's going to have unfortunate consequences for their relationship with the rest of us. So it's in everybody's interests, I think, Muslims and non-Muslims, that we all find a way of living more comfortably and happily together with each other. And that's got to be done within the framework of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. I mean, I don't think there's really any question about that. And OIBI is fully on board with that. And they think it's fully compatible with the Quran, with what you might call the best interpretation of the Islamic faith. But the other thing I would say about this is I've written a little bit about this. There's what I call the toxic trio. And there's Islamophobia. There's what you might call faux Islamophobia, or Islamophobia spelled with an FAUX in the middle of it. And there's Islamophobia. Now, Islamophobia in the true sense is as I said, a visceral hatred and hostility towards Muslims or Islam. Now, it exists in this country, but we don't know the extent of it. We don't know what drives it. We don't know whether it's we know very little about it, in other words, in this country. But there is also this, as I said, faux Islamophobia. But the third thing we haven't really talked about, which is what's driven the University of Bristol and the law school's reaction to what happened to me, is Islamophobia. It's the excessive fear of being considered to be an Islamophobe. There's a toxic trio. They each feed off each other. Each is Each is has got negative educational, intellectual, and social implications. And unless you tackle them all together, they kind of mutually reinforce each other.
Thank you. Sort of talking about kind of what happened, somebody else has asked another possible source, which is, to what extent do you find the weaponization of social media played a part in the Bristol Islamic Society getting the coverage they did?
Well, I think that's that's what's driven cancel culture generally, I think. Again, looking back in my my past, I mean, the thing that social media has done, it's kind of democratized insult, democratized debate. Way back in the day, you know, there were gatekeepers. You see, nobody could personally or privately get a point of view across. You had to rely on a newspaper or a journal or an organization which policed it. So, I mean, there may have been all kinds of issues about who the gatekeepers were and who got the opportunity to say what they wanted to say, and so on and so forth. And that wasn't a truly democratic environment either. But what social media has done, of course, has taken the gatekeepers away. So anybody with who wants to vent their spleen, and unfortunately there are certain people out there who just get a kick out of being unkind, unpleasant to other people. That just gives them the vehicle in which to do it. And I don't think everybody in Bristol was as mean-spirited as I think the formal complainant seems to have been, he was driven by, I don't know, I'm just speculating. I've never met him and I don't know where he is now, but I suspect he was driven by a kind of egotism. He wanted to just kind of show off to his friends and allies how he was defending the Muslim faith. He was a great, emir of the Muslim faith. He was going to, defend them from their enemies. And there's also, you see, one of the other strange things about this whole business, the Bristol business and other things, which is a particular problem in France, I've noticed in France, is this unholy alliance between conservative Muslims and the far left. And the reason the guy who brought the complaint in my case wanted to show both that he was a faithful Muslim and he was defending Islam, but he also wanted to show that he was on the same wavelength as the woke, so if you want to call them that, or the cancel culture mob, which is predominantly in the academy, driven by the far left. And that's a huge problem, and it's an intellectual conundrum, really, because the conservative Muslims are not really on a progressive wavelength by any stretch of the imagination, yet they're defended by what might be called the liberal left, or is also now known as the regressive left or the progressive left. And that's a huge problem, I think, especially since in arts, social sciences, and the humanities and universities, they're the dominant ideology, in my experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, moving on to another question. There are so many, so hopefully we can get through as many as we can. Julius Weinberg asks, how can we better engage with students who may come from a fairly narrow background with strong opinions and or cultural prejudices, with the ability to engage in debate and a broader range of opinions?
Well, the sad thing about my experience is I had no difficulty with that in my classes. I mean, I had a whole range of students, and as I've said, there was always a significant minority in the class who were Muslim. I was asked recently to estimate what that was, and I would have said it was somewhere between a quarter and a third. Now, how do we know? Well, some of the women actually turned up in traditional garb. Some of them wore hijab, so you could tell from that. You could tell from names. You could also tell because quite a few of them self-identify. They would say make a contribution to the class along the lines of as a Muslim. So we had a very free and open and comfortable discussion about all the things, and I've never felt intimidated or wary of debating the question of Islam and human rights in the class, because I knew everything that I said derived from the authoritative literature, and I didn't believe anybody would call me out on that, because there was nothing remotely Islamophobic about it. But beyond that context, in the wider context, it is very difficult, because student unions are dominated by a kind of wokish mentality now, and that's very censorious and very, very committed to cancel culture. But I think one of the things that encourages me about my experience is I had a lot of support from the Bristol Free Speech Society, which is not the same as the National Free Speech Union.
Yeah.
And they were very interested in my case from the get-go, and we had a very lively discussion like this a year ago, actually, before the more recent developments happened. And the law school tried to stop this. They made 3 attempts to stop it, and on the 3rd occasion, we just said we're just going to go ahead anyway. So basically, I think the way forward is for students to mobilize themselves, the sensible, intelligent, reflective and tolerant ones, to mobilize themselves in free speech societies and other ways to open up debate in these questions without fear.
Thank you. David Warden asks, is liberal and critical Islamic scholarship possible, and how liberal and critical is it? And is a reformation in Islam remotely possible?
Right, I'll take these questions in the reverse. I think there's a debate and there's literature about the possible need for reformation Islam. I think it does need to be modernized, let's put it like that. I think there can't be a reformation in the Islamic world in the same way as there was in Christendom in the early modern period, because the conditions for it don't obtain. In Christendom, in the late medieval, early modern period, there were social and political and intellectual pressures in this direction, which don't obtain in the Muslim world. Industrialization, the rise of science, and so forth, which is not, and the way in which those societies in the West were structured socially isn't the same in the Islamic world. But I do think there's a crisis in contemporary Islam between, well, let me put it another way. There's a great book, if you're interested in this, by Sarah Khan called The Battle for British Islam. And basically she documents and discusses how in this country there is a battle for British Islam between the conservative traditionalists and fundamentalists, Wahhabis, Salafists on one side, and the more liberal ones on the other. And I hope that battle, that struggle is won by the more liberal and more progressive ones. Yeah, but on this question, how liberal can a progressive liberal Islam be? I don't know. I mean, if you accept, if to be a Muslim, kind of the bottom line is, what do all Muslims believe, hold in common? They believe there's no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his prophet. Now, even that is open to interpretation. But if you believe the prophecy of Muhammad is the direct word of God, there's a limit to how liberalized that can become, because there are certain things that are very difficult to explain away in the Quran. For example, men having 4 wives or to 4 wives, and women only 1 husband. That's a very difficult one. If you believe that Muhammad was inspired by God, as has been the case with the kind of reinterpretation of the Bible, then almost anything's possible. You can debate the various interpretations. But then there's also tradition in the debates about the Quran between the Meccan verses, the Medinan verses, and people. So there's Muslims think that there's some stuff in the Medinan versions which are more hostile and more aggressive, because this was a period they were delivered at a time when Muslims were being physically persecuted and were at war, basically, with the Quraysh, which was Muhammad's original tribe. That these are no longer of a universal applicability. And of course, with any sacred text, with any faith, there's always this question: which elements are supposed to be universal and timeless, and which elements were delivered at the time for a specific purpose and no longer apply? So I mean, let me give you another example from Christian tradition. In Paul's Gospels, there's Paul's letters. I can't remember which one it was, but he said, "Let your women be quiet, silent in church." And if that was some fundamentalist Christians interpret that as being of universal significance, but a better view, I think, is that in that particular church in question, the women were very noisy, and they were chatting and gossiping and not paying attention. And all that Paul was saying was, in that particular church, the women ought to be a bit more respectful and a bit more quiet. So that and there's similar kind of things in the Quran.
Paul Clitter is asking an interesting question. What is the role of student organisations on a denominational basis? I mean, once you have a special Islamic student organisation, there arises the seduction to become a pressure group in the defence of religion. You have the same danger with Christian student organisations, perhaps. Could it be part of the solution to stimulate more pluralist student organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, hi Paul. Paul's been one of my more stalwart supporters throughout the whole.
Oh, lovely.
So I'm grateful to him. He told me he was going to be here. I'm grateful to him. This is the thing. This is why this just refers back to what I said about the student free speech societies, and I do think there is a sense. I do have a sense that a lot of students are just getting increasingly fed up with the way in which these intolerant militants are dominating the debate. But they're frightened, because if you stick your head above the parapet, or if you even say very innocuous things like I've said, you can be vilified and your life can be potentially at risk. And you don't have to do very much for that to be a possibility. So the fear is pulling in one direction, and frustration and kind of lack, a sense that they're not getting. The more intelligent students are not getting the proper education that they should be getting, because so many things increasingly are off limits. So you can't talk about it, and that that's no good. That's not university education where you're being. So what one of the risks that's at large here is that university education, particularly as I said in the humanities, arts, social sciences, is becoming like a kind of seminary. They're becoming like kind of seminary where they're being told a dogma. They're being trained in a dogma, rather than having their minds trained to think independently for themselves. It's like an Orthodox seminary or a Catholic seminary or whatever kind of seminary. You've got the belief system, and you can't stray outside of it. Otherwise, you're heterodox, or worse still, a heretic. So yeah, let's have more pluralism. I'm all for that.
Brilliant. And De Greer, I apologise if I get your name wrong there, says, is it not the case that in a liberal society, no religion is sacred, and therefore, whilst religious people can have the right to be respected, they cannot ask for their belief systems to be respected?
I think there's a difference between that is a very important distinction. It's not a distinction that's always easy to draw, between respecting the person and being critical of their beliefs. I think you can respect the right to have people have the right to be wrong, as long as they're not, wrong in the way that it makes them antagonistic towards one another. But you can believe anything you like, really, as long as you keep it to yourself, or you don't. It doesn't become a threat to anybody else. And we have the rest of us have the responsibility, the obligation to let them get on with it. I mean, there are people. There's a new flat Earth movement, for example, that's developed in recent years, and it's risible basically. But let them get on with it. You can engage with them and say, well, hang on, there's all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't believe that the Earth is flat. But if you want to do that, get on with it.
Yep. And I think that pretty much sums up the secularist approach as well. So, you're free to have whatever religion or belief you like, as long as it's not harming or imposing on others. So Greg Burke asks, do you think Muslim progressives could have a significant role in helping universities to take a more balanced view in dealing with such incidents, given that progressives themselves critically engage with traditional interpretations of Islam?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why an organization like the OIBI, its contribution is potentially so important, because there have been various attempts in the recent past to promote an anti-jihadi version of Islam. The Quilliam Society was a case in point. And what Quilliam went down the pan, down the plug hole, unfortunately, in my view, because they were financially supported by the government, and they were therefore accused of being collaborators and all of that kind of thing, Uncle Tom's, all of that kind of thing. And it's important, therefore, that an organization like OIBI maintains a distance from the state and from government. But as we've found, it's very difficult to find adequate funding from other sources. So yes, it's getting the progressive liberal voice properly heard in the academy is a great challenge, because the University of Bristol, you see, believed that BRISOC represented, as it were, the authentic voice of Islam. People like BRISOC claim to speak for, as in my case, I said, all Muslims or all Muslim students. Of course, they don't, because there's a whole spectrum of belief. There are different sects and traditions within Islam, quite apart from Sunni and Shia and Sufi. There's multiple sects. Some of them are, like the Ahmadiyya, are regarded as by the rest as heretics, and as they can even be targets for, one of the ironies of this is Muslims themselves can be guilty of Islamophobia by literally attacking, physically attacking others who claim to be Muslims, but whom they regard as heretics and as a danger to the true faith.
Now, I think you've touched on this, but you might want to add to it. Anthea Pablo asks, why do you think an academic institution like Bristol Uni has collaborated in the cancel culture when academia should be all about critical thinking? Well,
it's fear. It's fear, really. I mean, there are two types of fear. One is fear of actual physical retribution, but the more prominent fear, I think, is just the Islamophobia, the fear of being regarded as Islamophobic, and the impact that this might have upon their reputation for diversity and inclusivity and so forth, and how that might have a damaging effect upon student recruitment. That's what's fundamentally going on here. But what they should have done, of course, is they should have been more robust in the way in which they managed the original complaint, and they could have defended it just by saying, Steven Greer is not an Islamophobe. He's not done anything Islamophobic, and we're committed. We're equally committed to diversity, inclusivity, equity, and academic freedom. And in this case, in my case, there's absolutely no conflict at all between these commitments.
Nick Goodwin asks, I, like many others, am pained by examples of cancellation such as this one, But I also consider myself to be firmly on the left, and hence stand in solidarity with those discriminated against or feeling threatened because of their identity. So how do I find a place on the left that can support both positions? There is a danger that the right are taking the vanguard on cases such as this, in particular the Free Speech Union and the Academy of Ideas, both right-wing despite their neutral proclamations. That's his question.
Well, yes. I mean, this is a dilemma I've been in myself. I mean, I have been for most of my adult life on the centre left. I was a member of the Labour Party for 30 years. I left in 2013 when that was before Jeremy Corbyn took over, but it was kind of heading in that direction. And had I not left then, I would have certainly left once he came into office as the leader. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's fair to say the Free Speech Union is a right-wing organisation. I think it may well be dominated by people on the centre right because they take this whole the issue of free speech more seriously, frankly. I think what's happened on the left, as we said already, is the left have lost their commitment to freedom of speech because they're arguably because they believe that threatens the project of the emancipation of subordinate groups and inclusivity and diversity and all that stuff. Well, it doesn't. I mean, it's perfectly possible to be somebody like me, as the left used to be characterized, as somebody who's equally committed to diversity, inclusivity, removing discrimination, challenging discrimination, increasing the number of minority people in universities to be roughly commensurate with their profile in society at large, and to be equally committed to freedom of speech. I don't see any conflict between that. And moreover, I don't see how, when you crack down on freedom of speech and you engage in cancellation, that's going to emancipate these groups anyway, because the tragedies is it's never in human history has an attack upon one freedom led to an expansion of freedom generally. It hasn't happened, because what tends to happen in human history is once you crack down on one freedom, even for legitimate purposes, that tends to have a contaminating effect on other freedoms, then become vulnerable. And the freedom of expression is particularly central and instrumental here, because it's only when we've got freedom of expression we can identify risks to and attacks upon other freedoms. So that's why it's one of the most central, it's central to the whole debate about freedom and justice and equality and fairness generally.
Couldn't agree more. Interesting question, Anonymous here. You said that Prevent is based on a Saudi model. Do you think this is the ultimate reason why Bristol Islamic Society and other Federation of Students Islamic Society branches targeted you? In other words, are you caught up in a battle between Muslims of different persuasions about Prevent and the nature of Islam and Islamic engagement with Western states?
That's a very sophisticated question.
It is.
I don't think. No, I don't think that is the answer. I think what's going on here is that Prevent has been mischaracterized either through ignorance or a kind of malign attempt to discredit it to further other objectives. And I think both are going on. There is a certain element in the anti-Prevent movement which wants to discredit Prevent so that mobilization, Islamist mobilization, can take place. Now, not necessarily violent mobilization, but mobilization that divides, that makes the case for separate treatment from Muslims, presents them as a repressed minority, demands that they be given, as it were, separate rights or special treatment, for example, on the question of blasphemy. It's one element. And there are other elements, I think, who are just basically misled because they've bought into the whole. The other element, of course, is the far left element, who will believe anything. Their their kind of the default position is the liberal democratic state is a hoax. It's a fallacy. The liberal democratic state is predatory upon minorities. It persecutes minorities. It's all about defending a kind of, well, if you're familiar with the characterization heteronormative and racist and all of this kind of thing. So when you've got an assumption that the status has that character, and somebody says prevents Islamophobic and racist, you say, yeah, of course it must be, because that's what the state does. But if you actually examine the evidence for this claim, you'll see it very, very rapidly evaporates. So I think there is I don't think the Saudis are not funding as far as I know, the Saudis are not funding the Prevent program. It was just that the particular model that they had was proven to be quite effective and has been copied by other countries, not just the UK.
Yeah, right. It's 7 p.m. now, but we've still got 41 open questions here. So let's try and see how many we might have to keep the answers fairly short if possible, to try and get through as many of these. And actually, speaking of funding, this is a good question to follow up on. Is that Rarid Lloyd? Apologies if I get your name wrong there. Is it fair to argue that mandatory influence from nations where any critique or open discussion of Islam is a criminal offence, for example, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., on British universities, is the reason behind their kowtowing to Islamist agitation?
Can you repeat that?
Sorry. Is it fair to argue that monetary influence from nations where any critique or open discussion of Islam is a criminal offence, so Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for example, on British universities is the reason behind their kowtowing to Islamist agitation?
Maybe. I do think the UK is on a sticky wicket in a sense that because it's so financially linked to Saudi Arabia, there's all kinds of trade and other connections and the sale of arms and all kinds of stuff going on like that. It makes it potentially maybe more difficult to. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I'm going to kind of contradict where I was heading with the answer. I think notwithstanding the links that the UK has with Saudi Arabia, it's still capable of dealing with or tackling jihadi terrorism without being genuinely accused of being Islamophobic. That's the way I would answer that question.
Right. Rita Blom says, since your exoneration, have you sued Bristol University for slander?
Oh, hi, Rita. There's another person who's been with whom I've been corresponding. It's nice to see all my supporters getting a look in. Well, it's under consideration. I do have a team of lawyers, but there are other ways. There's more ways to skin a cat, as the expression goes. What I would prefer, rather than going down that route, is to have the university sanctioned by the Office for Students or the Charity Commission. I think that'll be a far more powerful way of sending the message that they shouldn't have done what they've done.
Umesh Patak asks, what is the top change you would recommend to the current Prevent programme?
Say it again, please.
What is the top change you would recommend to the current Prevent programme?
More transparency, just more information about this category, this wide category of it's neither Islamist nor extreme right. They say the incel movement features pretty prominently in that. That's the main thing, more transparency, but more accountability. But then that's the kind of thing that people like me always demand.
Elaine Chambers asks, will Islam get a tighter grip on British freedom of speech, or will it fade away?
I don't think Islam is going to fade away anytime soon in this country or anywhere else. And there is a risk unless we deal with this various challenges to free speech, particularly in universities. Islam isn't the only one by any means. That before long we'll be living in a society where there's very, very little freedom of speech.
From Janus Arya, shouldn't kafir-phobia be addressed, given both local and global realities, both legal and societal cases in many Islamic states and Islamist-dominated countries? Apparently, even the UK, given many cases, including yours. Might have to explain what kafir-phobia is. Well,
that'll be a fear of people who are non-Muslim. Yeah, of course. I mean, this cuts both ways. I mean, throughout history, since the advent of Islam, there's been great friction between what was then Christendom and Islam, what's now the West and Islam, and there's not really much sign of this being, definitively resolved.
Let's see. There's another one actually by Janus, which is quite interesting. Do you think big media's apologistic representation of Islamism played a significant role in your case?
I don't really understand the question. Big media's
apologistic representation of Islam, so how Islamism has been represented in the media. Do you think that that's played a significant role in what happened to you?
Well, I would say that the representation of Muslims in the British media is quite negative. I think, it's most of the media in this country is centre right or further right, and they're generally not particularly sympathetic to Islam abroad and in this country. So I don't think that's the case.
From Keith Pennington, is it not sufficient that we have laws about general hate speech without the need for specific definitions for Islamophobia or anti-Semitism? Do these definitions themselves not help create the conditions to make the situation more dangerous?
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I don't think we should go down the path of trying to define what Islamophobia is. As you say, it's where we should kind of pin our colours to.
Hey, just going through a few more here. There's quite a few just keep coming in. Let's see. This is from Prakash Shah. What is your view of the removal by the House of Lords on the ability to directly access the courts in the current higher education bill? I don't know if you've had a look at that at all, or...
I'm broadly in favour of the higher education bill. There's very little that I would object to in it. I think, people should. The debate is about whether it's productive or counterproductive to involve the courts in this whole thing. I think they should be, because, as I said in my own introductory remarks, or in answer to previous one of Megan's questions, universities have forfeited the right to self-police. They need to be brought to heel and brought into line, because they can be trusted to protect academic freedom without significant external oversight. The courts would be, they're under legal obligations, so the courts have got to be involved.
So Mike Parrish is asking, as a gay man and previously a student, knowing that Islam has a specific and deadly solution for people like me, are you surprised that student unions have become, as you call them, seminaries for social justice? Is that rather like creating pseudo-religious protection?
Don't fully understand the question. What I would say is that not all branches of Islam are homophobic. My friend and colleague, Dr. Tash Hargay, who's the provost of Oxford Institute for British Islam, conducts, he blesses gay partnerships. Stops short of gay marriage, but he's quite happy to bless gay partnerships. So that's pretty far down the route of, that's about as liberal as you can get, I think. in contemporary progressive Islam. What was the second part of the question?
So I've lost the question now, but I think you have pretty much answered that one. One anyway. So that's interesting. I do
think that the wokeism is a kind of religion. Doubt about that, and it's a secular religion, but it's got many of the other features of religion: dogma, ritual, binary view of good and evil, belief that they have a monopoly of good over evil, and the vilification and victimization of heretics. Ticks nearly all of the boxes.
Question from Stephen here. You said you'd like the Office for Students to sanction the university. Do you think that the Office for Students are effective as a regulator?
Not yet, but they will be once they get the powers that are coming down the road from the Higher Education Freedom of Speech bill. But they still, they could do more of what the powers they've got, I think. But that's the way things are headed.
Let's see. This isn't my question, but it's a fairly interesting comment here from Lisa Garbett. I've had threats of violence and I've had to fend off police within the Prevent programme. One of the worst experiences of my life. Islam is feeding off the polarisation of left and right, and teenagers cannot even express anger at halal slaughter. RE, religious education whitewashes Islam. Islamic separatism is a huge problem.
Yes, it is. We need to tackle it in all the ways I suggested by just opening up debate, having an honest and open debate.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm just trying to find out. There was one interesting one that I saw a minute ago. Let's see. Oh yeah, another one from that's the one I was looking for. It's another one from Rearid Lloyd again. Is it not fair to argue that a tolerant and liberal approach to discussing Islam is exactly what has led us to the situation we're in now, with teachers and children living with de facto blasphemy laws?
No. Because what's the alternative to not have a discussion about it?
Yeah. Okay. We have now sort of run on for 15 minutes over now, so I think we should maybe close with one question here from Mick Murray. Academic freedom has always had to be fought for. What needs to be done to find allies, particularly the academic trades unions?
Well, I'm sorry to say it, I think the UCU is hopeless on this question. They were reluctant to take my case on board. And one thing I didn't say in respect of my own experience was early on, before I was exonerated, I contacted one of the law school UCU representatives, and she refused to get involved. She said she couldn't get involved in my case because of a conflict of interest, because she disputed. She was just so vehemently opposed to my views about the Prevent programme and other things. So she referred me to elsewhere in the UCU. But if you look at the UCU handled the Kathleen Stock case, Stock said the UCU, her union, who was supposed to be defending her from her interests and so on and so forth, she said they effectively ended her career because they appeared to side more with the trans mob that was gunning for her than they sided with her. So what I think really needs to happen is the left has got to get wise to this and realize that this is not their allegiance shouldn't be to. We shouldn't have this assumption on the left that whatever a minority says has been done to them, or however they've been offended. We've got to take that at face value, and we've just got to accept it, and we've got to stigmatize and punish the person who's offended them. That's effectively what the University of Bristol has done with me. And we've got to get beyond this rather kind of tired and limited binary distinction between left and right. One of the things that happened to me in this debate, of course, is that I have been catapulted in some ways against my will from the centre left to the centre right, because I found much more support for me personally and for the stance that I've taken from the centre right than from the centre left. But in the centre of British politics and all politics, that's where this campaign really, I think, has got to be rooted, because there's a lot more, there's a lot more congruence between people, intelligent people and humane people on the centre left and the centre right than you might think. The further you get to the margins, the less that might be the case. But once you get to the extremes, they tend to be almost mirror images of each other. But in the centre ground is where I think this whole, counteroffensive against cancel culture and all that goes with it has got to be organised and mounted.
Brilliant. I think that's really good place to close. So thank you so much for joining us for what's turned out to be a really good discussion with so many different questions, and for very kindly being here for talking for quite some time. And thank you everyone for attending and for all your great questions tonight. I'm so sorry if we didn't get round to your question. Please do email us if you do want to put a question to Professor Greer. We'll pass it on to him. And any other comments that you have. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you at a future NSS talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.